Hey guys, this is Jen with Iris Ministries, and this is a prophetic teaching that the Holy Spirit gave me through several downloads. So, this is going to be quite a comprehensive teaching. There's a lot of information in it. In fact, this is not even really all of it. I'm sure I'm going to probably do a few follow up videos about this because it's number one, such a big topic, but also number two, it's such an important topic. So, the general subject here is about how Jesus heals our mind from trauma. So, the reason why this is so important right now, and if you are someone who is gifted prophetically, you probably have already felt this very strongly in the spirit, probably over the last like 3 to 6 months. It's definitely something that is very heavy on the heart of the Lord. He wants to basically heal everyone's trauma because there is not a single one of us that can say that we have not experienced trauma. Sometimes it's easy to think that that doesn't apply to you if you think, well, I haven't had, something really severe happen to me. But every single one of us has experienced trauma because that is the world that we live in. So, the reason why this is so important, though, to the Lord right now is that He is very much bringing everyone into this time where He wants to bring us fully out of our self and help us to completely surrender to His Spirit. Because, of course, that was the whole goal for all of us this whole time. But religion and works and watered down doctrine and man-based doctrine has kept us from walking in the fullness of that. So this is the time that we're coming into now where He is going to restore that power, restore that authority, help His people to walk in the fullness of His Spirit. But of course that requires us to fully surrender ourselves and to basically get our flesh out of His way. And the only way that we can do that is to be willing to address the traumas that we've been through and address the incorrect thinking, the incorrect beliefs that we have, so that He can give us the correct ones. So, just to give you, a simple example, if you had a trauma in your past where you were assaulted or even molested as a child, and say you're a woman and this assault happened by a man, then later on, God could be calling you to minister to a man, maybe even a man that struggles with that particular demon. Maybe he struggles with sexual perversion. You, in your spirit, want to obey the Lord. You want to help this person. You want to minister. But your flesh will very much get in your way because you still have an unhealed wound inside of you and you still are holding whatever those emotions are, anger, resentment, bitterness, and those things will get in your way. So that's just like a simple example, but it can affect you in multitudes of ways. Your traumas, they can cause you to be so insecure that you refuse to agree with God, that you can even do what He's calling you to do. There's just multitudes of ways that these traumas create these incorrect beliefs in your mind, which of course is all the workings of the enemy, and then lead you to not be able to fully walk in the life that God has for you. So this is kind of just a background on why this is so important. And really, there's, again, so much to this, but really, generally speaking, trauma causes each one of us to want to be in control of our environment. Because really, think about it, we don't like to not be in control because then we can't, quote, protect ourselves. Because then we feel vulnerable, we feel exposed. If we're not in control, then we feel like that's not safe. So you can see where that would come into direct conflict with God, because God calls us to give up control and to totally lay down our will and totally surrender to His. So this is where a major conflict happens, and this is why we need to be able to go in and look at these things. So a lot of this is sort of scientific, and then what's so cool about how the Holy Spirit works is he relates the scientific part to the spiritual part, and he combines them so that you can understand literally what's happening, and also at the same time see how he's showing you the way out. So to start, again, with what I was just talking about, control is basically our idea of self-preservation. And I say idea because it's really not control. We just perceive it as control. We think, well, as long as I'm, trying to control things, I am preserving myself. I'm protecting myself. But of course, that whole thing is an illusion, because we know that we really aren't in control. We just like to think that we are, but we really aren't, because we know at any time things completely outside of our control can happen. And so then this notion of self-preservation, self-protection sort of gets blown to pieces. And I actually just posted a word that he gave me that's called no more self-protection. And this is why this is so important, is he's trying to show where self-protection doesn't even work anyway, and that our safest place to be is under his covering and in full total covenant with him, because then his wings are over us and he's the one that protects us. And so we don't want to be in ourself. We don't want to be on our own, because then it is up to us, and that's not going to work out well for us. So basically, to look at this hierarchy, really we have to get to the roots of what is going on at a deep level. That's the only way that we're going to ever get out of this stuff. We can't just deal with what's on the surface, because that is only a cover emotion. So usually the emotions that are right there on the surface, they're the emotions that we think we have control in. So it's usually one of two ways that people will react to situations. They will either have a very aggressive response to a stressor, and they will be angry, they might be critical, might be prideful, or the opposite would be someone who tends to withdraw when they're faced with a trauma or faced with a stressor, and they are more afraid. So both of these, though, are just surface kind of emotions, because you're still trying to just maintain control and quote unquote protect yourself by doing either of these things. By either being afraid and withdrawing, you're trying to control the situation and preserve yourself, or by getting angry and lashing out and being aggressive, you're trying to control the situation and preserve yourself. But either way, what's underneath that emotion is pain and hurt. So again, just like in the word I just released, where the Holy Spirit was speaking through these different examples with animals, what he wants us to remember is that even someone who lashes out at us, someone who is aggressive, someone who is angry and prideful and critical, it is because they have a pain and a hurt underneath that has not been dealt with. So not only is he showing all of us these things to help us heal ourselves, but this is extremely important when it comes to helping us have grace and forgiveness and patience and gentleness for others. Because if we can look through the surface emotions and see, hey, this is a person who's hurt underneath, this is a person who does not feel safe, this is why they're acting this way to me, that helps us to do what we're supposed to do, which is react with compassion and patience and not be offended. So this is important for both ways, for ourselves and for others. So again, then underneath the pain and the hurt are feelings of not being safe, of not being secure, of not having control. And then of course, really what's at the root of that is whatever those traumas are that caused this cascade of emotions, this cascade of false beliefs. Generally speaking, these traumas usually go back to our childhood, possibly even to being an infant. But of course, we all experience traumas throughout our adult life too. So it ends up kind of just becoming a echo in our life. It becomes a repeating pattern. But to find the real roots, to find where the false foundation got laid, where the false beliefs got laid, that usually requires going all the way back to the beginning to what traumas happened to us when we were a child. So on either side, again, of this, whether you react aggressively or whether you react or you withdraw, those are biological responses. So there is a certain actual biological process that happens in your body, and that is an emotional response. So it's both going on at one time, but it's important to be able to understand how this works, because then you can really understand what's going on with you. Because that's why I hate these personality tests and these little things where you identify as, oh, I'm this number, or I'm this combination of letters or whatever, because those are so not true. Because what that is basically saying is, oh, this is just who you are. And so you don't have to ever, worry about being different or try to change or anything like that, because this is just who you are. And that's not true, because for each one of us, we are basically a culmination of all the things that have happened to us. So like I said, you could be, dealing with a lot of low self-esteem from things that happened to you as a child, and that's why you're kind of quiet. That's why you're not very outspoken. That's why you don't like to take leadership roles, because you don't believe in yourself because of these traumas that happened to you when you were a child. Well, you can't just identify yourself with a particular personality trait and say, oh, well, that's just me. See, I was just never meant to be a leader. I'm just a shy person. No, those are lies that got planted in you as a child and are now holding you back from walking out in your full potential. And you can't just accept those and receive those and agree with those, because they're not true. So this is why the Holy Spirit wants to take us through these processes. And we should be willing to let Jesus do this, because he wants to really just get all of this junk off of us that was laid on us and get us down to who we actually are meant to be. So again, the biological response that happens in our bodies when we're faced with a stressor, faced with a trauma, is, you may have heard fight or flight. They now add this third one onto it, because it's fight, flight, or freeze. And basically, just to explain what that is, if you think about an animal who's in nature, if a danger is detected, then that animal, if it seems possible, will fight back against the predator. Now, if that animal determines that they cannot fight back against the predator, if they look at it and realize, oh, this predator's 5 times stronger than me, 5 times faster than me, then they will try to flee the scene in order to save themselves. If both of these options appear to be impossible, if they don't believe they can fight it, if they cannot flee, that's not an option, then what they will do is they will freeze, and they will try to remain as still as possible and as quiet as possible, hoping that the predator will lose interest and leave. So you can see where each one of these 3 things is an attempt for the animal to save itself. It's a way of reacting to a predator, a trauma, a stressor, a danger in self-protection. Now, this is the same thing that happens in us when we are faced with a stressor. So again, going back to that chart, that shows where, depending on how you were brought up, usually, you will react in one of these 2 ways. You will either automatically kick into the fight response, and if that's how you were raised, that you were conditioned to understand, hey, the only way I'm going to survive this environment is that I've got to be aggressive, I've got to fight before they can fight me, I've got to stand up for myself, then you would tend to react automatically in that way, while some others may have survived their traumas in their childhood by just withdrawing into themselves and either running away and fleeing the scene, or if they couldn't do that, then just freezing and just going inside of themselves, basically. So again, the reason why we don't like to not be in control is because we feel like we can't protect ourselves. But especially in this time now more than ever, God is calling us higher. He is our protector. We were never supposed to be our own protection and covering, but we have to undo all these lies and undo all these false roots that will be working against us, because then when God says, okay, surrender to me, let go, fully let me be your protection and your covering, fully surrender to me and let me lead your life. Again, we can want to do that intellectually, we can want to do that in our spirit, but if everything inside of us is still operating on an incorrect system, it's going to fight us, and it's going to pretty much leave us at a dead end, at a conflict of which thing we're going to do, follow our spirit or follow our flesh. So to again explain a little bit more about trauma, traumatic incidents don't complete processing. So again, when you hear processing, it probably makes you think of a computer, and that's the perfect example. Because when an experience basically exceeds our ability to handle it, our ability to cope with it, it doesn't finish processing. It gets stored in our body's tissues until it can be released. So this uncompleted impulse, basically, that gets stopped, it gets trapped in our nervous system. So this right here is why we need to renew our mind, because especially if we've had a series of traumas in our life, we can have a series of these uncompleted impulses that got trapped up in our nervous system that is constantly making us feel like we have to protect ourselves, constantly making us feel like we're in danger or we're stressed out. Even if we can't actually identify an actual stressor happening, our body is still stuck in that mode because of things that have happened to us in the past. So again, the body activates a protective mechanism to stop the trauma from processing. So that's what will basically halt the body in fight or flight or freeze and cause that energy to be stored in the tissues. And additionally, the brain can actually also disconnect from that part of the body, and that can prevent memory of the trauma. And that's why some people will have repressed memories where they don't even remember the trauma happening to them, which was the case with me. That was definitely something that came up where when I was going through my heart healing time with the Lord, He brought up this memory that I did not even know was there. And of course, He knew it was there, and He knew how it was affecting me, and it actually turned out to be one of the most substantial wounds that He had to heal, because it was really, that was what was at the bottom, the foundation of all of these incorrect beliefs I had. So if I never knew that that memory was there and I never addressed that wound, I would have really had difficulty moving forward. So that's why it's so awesome to go through this with Jesus Himself, because who knows you better than the one who made you, and He can really help you come out of all of this just mess that you've been through, the more and more and more you're willing to lean in and let Him do it. So if you don't really understand what I mean when I say it gets trapped in your tissues, this is just kind of a little side note, but it's incredibly interesting if you want to look into it sometime on your own. But it has been proven scientifically that water is able to hold memories. So there was a whole experiment that this man did where he would speak over water, and in one container of water he would speak positive words of love and peace, and the water would form crystals, form molecules that were beautiful. They would look like snowflakes. They would just look gorgeous. Then in the other container, he would speak words of hate, words of disgust, just negative things over it. And it would literally form these grotesque, diseased-looking crystals and molecules. So what he ended up proving was that water could retain memories, particularly of words spoken. And then, of course, if you take that a step further and you remember that our bodies are made up of over 70% water, that just shows how when you have a trauma, whether it's a physical trauma, something that was spoken over you, both, it gets retained in the tissues of your body. So, post traumatic stress, which again, you might just relate to, soldiers coming back from the war, people that used to be policemen or firemen or something like that. But this is actually for anyone that has been through any type of trauma, which again, we all have at some point. Um, Post traumatic stress will cause you to focus on detecting and avoiding situations that may cause you further trauma. So, this is, to put it really simply, that voice, that unending thought process that you always have about what if, where you're projecting yourself into future events, you're rehearsing things in your mind, you're fixating on what ifs all the time because basically you're stuck in survival mode. So your energy is constantly focused on fighting off these unseen things, fighting off these things that haven't even happened yet. And so that not only inhibits your ability to be present and to actually enjoy your life, but it certainly also inhibits your ability to pay attention to others' needs because you are totally focused on surviving. So again, from the outside, you could perceive somebody who's experiencing this as being self-centered and being selfish and not listening to other people or not paying attention to other people. Well, again, this is where we have to have some compassion and some understanding, because if somebody's going through this, they can't even stop it really. They are so focused on survival and they're so trapped in this cycle of anxiety and fear that they can't pay attention to other people's needs because their main focus is surviving themselves. So to look at the definition of the word trauma, it is a deeply disturbing or distressing experience, an emotional shock following a stressful event or a physical injury. And then an additional definition that I thought was extremely helpful as far as, again, relating this to the spiritual, is an injury such as a wound to living tissue that is caused by an extrinsic agent. Now, the word extrinsic means not part of the essential nature of something. And of course, essential or essence means the permanent, real, or ultimate nature of a thing. So if you put all that together, then you could say trauma is an injury or a wound caused to living tissue by an outside agent, something that is not inherent, permanent, or in our real nature. So looking at that, that is like a perfect breakdown of what trauma is and how it affects you. Because trauma are wounds. They are wounds that were caused in us. Emotional wounds, physical wounds, wounds that were caused in us by things outside of us. And it has caused, these wounds in our living tissue has caused behaviors, beliefs, reactions, traits of our personalities that are not inherent to who we actually are, that are not permanent. Our real nature is from God, not what trauma imposes on us. So this is why, again, I hate those personality tests, and why we can't just write somebody off and say, oh, they're just a very selfish person. Oh, they're just very self-centered. Oh, they're just very angry. Oh, they're just so isolated. They just never want to be around people. Like, they're so antisocial. You can't throw these labels on people, because what's actually happening is these wounds, these injuries they have been through, is causing them to act in a way that is not inherent in their real nature. Because again, if God created us, then we know our real nature is loving and peaceful and kind and all of these things that He is, because we are made in His image. So obviously these other things are not part of our real nature, and they have come from something outside of us. And that's why we have to be willing to look at these things. So again, like I said earlier, everybody has had trauma. We can't just think, oh, well, I haven't had, I haven't been in a war. I haven't had something, really bad happen to me or my family, and think, okay, I haven't been through trauma. Because at the very least, 95% of births in America are considered traumatic. So birth is a transition. It's a transitional period So what happens at birth alone can be kept locked up in your body as trauma. Because basically, if the birth experience doesn't foster trust or a feeling that it's safe, then the fight or flight response will be elicited. So if your experience of coming into the world as a baby does not foster a feeling of safety, a feeling of trust, for whatever reason, then automatically your fight or flight response is going to kick in. So again, like in animals, when a danger is detected, if it seems possible, then you will fight it. If you determine that you cannot fight it, then you'll flee. If both are impossible, then you will freeze. So thinking of that, when a fight or flight response is activated in babies, it creates a strong memory in their nervous system, because think about it. Infants can't fight, they can't flee, so they have to freeze. So if an infant detects a trauma at birth, and that could be anything, that could be a trauma of them getting stuck in the mother's birth canal, of the doctor forcibly removing them. That was what happened to me as a baby. They forcibly removed me. It could be, the doctors pumping the mom's system full of drugs. Whatever that trauma is, if the baby's nervous system takes that as a trauma and that fight or flight kicks in and they can't fight and they can't flee, then they will freeze. So this will get recorded in their nervous system. So then they will create similar responses to similar cues until it's been resolved. And basically what that means is if you got programmed as a baby to freeze, then you will tend to have a similar response to traumas and stresses in the future until you address that, because your body says, oh, trauma, I have to freeze. Oh, danger, I have to freeze. So it's starting a pattern of behavior that's getting programmed into your nervous system. So birth trauma can also cause you to revert to survival mode under stress and harbor mistrust, indifference, or to have a heightened sense of independence. Because again, it causes your shock response basically to activate more readily to every stressor that comes along. So ironically, it's adding more trauma and exhaustion because it's sort of overreacting to everything that comes your way, everything that is the least bit stressful. It activates that same response because it's just stuck in survival mode. And again, this can be going on so subconsciously at such a deep level that you may not even be aware of it. You may just, again, throw some labels on yourself and say, oh, I've just always been this way. I just always react this way, when there's actually a reason in your nervous system why these things are happening. So again, this is where this ties in with the spiritual, because if a person is in a state of relative helplessness, then the brain will respond the same as in a trauma. So really think about that sentence. So if a person is in a state where they feel relatively helpless, then their brain is going to register that as a trauma, and it's going to respond in the same way it's been programmed to respond to traumas. Well, if God is coming along and he's saying, hey, I want you to fully surrender to me, I want you to fully let go and trust me, that can be perceived as a state of relative helplessness, because you're suddenly helpless to protect yourself. You're helpless to take care of yourself. You're helpless to decide where you're going in life and what you're going to do, because you're surrendering to God. But that's why people that have a traumatic past often have difficulty with fully surrendering and trusting God, because this is happening in their brain. So this is again why he wants to bring all of this to light, because people are getting stuck in guilt and they're getting stuck in shame, and they're thinking, why am I so whatever? Why am I so stubborn? Why is it so hard for me to let go of control? Why can't I just trust God? Why do I keep, giving things to him and then taking them back? Well, this is why, because you have a traumatic past and a nervous system that's working against you. So it's nothing you have to feel guilty or ashamed about. It's something that he wants to help you with. You just have to be aware of what's actually happening. So some ways that this can actually manifest in your life is an inferiority complex, an inability to finish things, which definitely especially relates to birth traumas like mine, where you weren't allowed to take your time and you weren't allowed to leave the womb naturally. You were forcibly brought into the world, whether that was, with drugs or with tools. I was born a long time ago, we'll just say, and so they were actually using tools back then where they would literally physically pull you out. It can also leave you feeling unwelcome or unsafe, unloved or alone. You can have difficulty making decisions, and you can feel like no one understands. These are all just ways that this birth trauma can manifest in your life at a later point. So now, again, to get in a little bit more of the science, this is basic stuff. Does not go into real in-depth stuff. But again, it's important to understand because you can see how all of this ties together. So basically, the limbic system is the part of your brain that controls emotions and memories. So a limbic imprint is when prenatal, perinatal, or postnatal, so, before you're born, when you're born, and after you're born, cause those experiences to imprint on the limbic system of your brain. So that's, again, why you can end up feeling lifelong effects, because it will imprint these experiences that you had as an infant, as a baby, on this part of your brain. So again, if a child is born under traumatic circumstances, then that stress that they experience, that trauma, will turn into a normal expectation for them. So the trauma they went through at that point will register as normal in their brain. So that's how you can end up having this notion of normal, or this comfort zone that's imprinted into your nervous system, that's actually undesirable. That's actually not something that you want, but it's been imprinted in you as normal. So then you will subconsciously go about recreating it throughout your life. Now, I put down in parentheses here self-fulfilling prophecies and generational curses, because again, this is where you have to see where the science and the spiritual combine, because science will outright tell you the first part. They'll say, oh yeah, you can absolutely, have a sense of normal imprinted into your nervous system that is undesirable, and you will subconsciously go about recreating it. They will 100% admit that. But what we need to see is why that's happening, is that what is going on behind that is that the enemy is trying to just create generational curses that just keep going and going and going throughout generations of families, where you actually fulfill these self-fulfilling prophecies because you believe what is a lie. So to give you an example to sort of make that more understandable, if you as a baby, were birthed into a family where there was constant fighting, constant yelling, constant turmoil, and that got imprinted and coded into your nervous system as normal, even though it's undesirable, that is what your nervous system has imprinted in your brain as normal. So then you will subconsciously go out and recreate it. So you will subconsciously find a partner that will recreate that same atmosphere for you. So this is why you see people that grew up in abusive relationships ending up in abusive homes, ending up in abusive relationships. Even though if you ask them, they would probably say that's the last thing they ever wanted to do. Like, you could ask a man who was a little boy who grew up seeing his mom get beaten. He'd say, oh, I wanted to protect my mom. I hated, seeing what happened to her, and I swore I'd never be that way. And then he finds himself being older and doing the same thing. There's much, much, much more going on underneath the surface, because if your nervous system is imprinted to think of something as normal, then you will just keep repeating that and recreating that and finding it, seeking it out on a subconscious level, because that is normal to you. So this again is why we can, find ourselves in these situations where they don't have to be as extreme as the one I just mentioned, but just any kind of situation where we find ourselves saying, why does this always happen to me? Or it seems like I always ... Well, because there's something going on there. There's some kind of incorrect belief going on there where you have believed something, and that is why you keep acting it out. You keep sort of playing it out because your brain is basically telling you that's normal. So, you see people who grew up in extreme poverty, extreme lack. They win the lottery and they lose all their money in like the first 6 months because they have believed their whole life that poverty is normal for them, lack is normal for them, struggle is normal for them. So it's almost like their brain can't compute and can't understand how to have wealth, how to have comfort, that it has to get back to its baseline. It has to get back to what makes sense to it. So it will find its way back to that. And again, this is negative stuff. This is undesirable stuff, but this is just on such a subconscious level. This is just how our programming is working. So this is why, again, it's so important to be aware spiritually of what's going on so that you can ask God to help you with these things. Ask him, hey, show me where I've believed false things about myself, where I believe, incorrect beliefs, where I have the wrong operating system. Renew my mind, heal my heart, get these things out of me, because he doesn't want you trapped in this, certainly. And we just need to be aware of what's going on so that we realize there's a freedom outside of this. So again, trauma can go all the way back to even inside of the womb, because you can pick up cues of fear or anxiety from your mother, just, from being inside of her and receiving like the stress hormones that are coursing through her if she's in a fearful or anxious situation, or things that are often reinforced at birth and in your childhood. So people who have what's referred to as childhood PTSD are basically in a state of stress all the time. So everything is hard for them. So since they don't want any additional stress on top of just getting through the day, they will do the minimum to quote unquote survive. So again, this is extremely important to be able to have grace for other people, understanding for other people, compassion for other people, because you can look at someone and say, oh, they're just lazy, oh, they're just a procrastinator, but you have no idea what's actually going on inside of this person. Because if this person grew up in an extremely traumatic childhood, then their brain is in a constant state of survival all the time. So everything is hard. So just for them to get up and make themselves presentable and go to a job and sit at a desk and be around other people and have to interact and go through the day, like that is so hard that anything beyond that would be stressful to them, again, on a subconscious level. So they might not feel equipped to do anything in addition to that, which from the outside could be perceived as laziness or procrastination, but on the inside, again, is really just about survival and about protection. That's why, again, this all comes down to this sort of false notion of self-protection. And that's because, again, the trauma brain is basically running in the background all the time, analyzing everything. What might happen? What should I do? It's always on alert, and it's always being hypervigilant. And that's basically because the trauma has taught you not to trust. It's taught you that everyone is dangerous, everything is dangerous, that emotional attachment to others could end up meaning you getting hurt, and that you always need to protect yourself. So this can be really obvious or extremely subtle. And I'll give you an extremely subtle reaction out of my own experience. So I definitely had a lot of this trauma brain, childhood PTSD stuff going on, not just from my birth, but just from different things in my childhood. And one of the ways that the Holy Spirit highlighted to me where this was still affecting me, and I didn't even realize it because it was so subtle, was I would find myself in situations where I would be invited to do something, asked to go somewhere, and I would turn down the invitation, and I would notice when I turned it down, like the moment I turned it down, I'd feel this flicker of sadness. Like, I really wanted to go, but I almost from I couldn't help myself from declining it. It was the strangest thing. And I mean, this was so fast, it was like a millisecond of a feeling. But it was enough that as he sort of trained me in all of this and, tuned me into everything, that I started realizing that I would have that feeling. And he ended up illuminating that to me and showing me that that was an example of this happening. Because, for example, if somebody asked me to go to, let's say, like a outdoor street festival, and I'm sitting at home and I'm like cozy in my chair with my blanket and my book, and it's my cozy little house with my dogs, and everything feels comfortable. To my brain, the option of going out of the house, being outside at a festival with lots of people around, where I can't control what happens, I can't control, what I'm going to eat, or what the weather is going to be like, whatever, that deep down, if I still have this trauma brain analyzing everything, then what it would do is it would look at the two options and it would say, well, home, safety, comfort, safer than out, people, undesirable, uncontrollable, so stay home. So even if I wanted to go, subconsciously something would make me go, no, I'm comfortable, I'm just going to stay home. So I hope that makes sense, because that's as subtle as it can be. When he finally showed that to me, then I was able to say, oh, I see what's going on here. I don't have to give in to this anymore. I don't have to agree with this anymore. I am safe because God keeps me safe. I don't have to give in to this. I'm going to go. And that's when you can start making different decisions and following his truth and being set free from some of these lies that you didn't even know were keeping you bondage or keeping you held back. So to go a little tiny bit deeper into the science, basically the amygdala is your feeling brain. So as opposed to your thinking brain, this is your feeling brain. So this is very much a survival-oriented part of your brain. It's where your emotions are given meaning. It's where they are remembered and attached to associations. So basically creating emotional memories. And of course, no surprise, it has a major role in processing fear and driving that fight or flight or freeze response. So it is involved in the consolidation of memories with a strong emotional component. So if you have a lot of memories that are particularly have particularly strong feelings of fear around them, or strong feelings of sadness around them, these memories, when they get consolidated, can create generalized statements and generalized beliefs, where you can say, all men are angry if you grew up with an angry father, or all women are critical and judgmental if you grew up with a mom that acted that way. You make these generalized statements and you start to have these false beliefs. So it also performs a role in memory and decision making, which is why, again, if you have a brain that's been impaired with trauma, these faculties, your memory and decision making, can also be impaired. So again, you can think, oh, I've just always been that way. I've just always had a bad memory, or I've always had trouble making decisions. And that's not true. It's something else that's going on there that's working against you. So basically, when a person experiences a traumatic event, whatever that stimulus is, it causes adrenaline to rush, and the memory is imprinted in the amygdala. So it basically holds, again, traps in the tissue. It holds the intensity of the emotion that you felt around that event. And then it triggers, sorry, I skipped over it. It triggers the fight or flight or freeze response. So the important thing to note here is that the amygdala can actually be triggered before you are consciously aware of it. Because remember, this is your feeling brain. So this is an emotional response. So what an amygdala hijack is basically an emotional response that is immediate, it's overwhelming, and it's out of measure with the stimulus, because it's basically triggered an emotional threat. So this could be referred to as when someone, quote, loses it. So again, An example would be if someone says something to you and it was either just a joke or it was like something not even that serious, but you have a unhealed wound about criticism, then it can cause an immediate, overwhelming, out of measure reaction where you just lash out at the person because what it was actually triggering was an emotional threat that you have from deeper wounds about being criticized, about being, picked on or put down. But you immediately have this overreaction to something that was not even the case because of this deeper emotional trigger. So this, again, to add the spiritual to it, this is how the enemy takes advantage of unhealed wounds. Because, I've explained, I think in other videos, where if you think of like a wound, a cut on your arm, if it's open, then you can still get stuff in there that's going to irritate it. You can still get dirt in there and dust, and people can poke at it and it'll hurt. But once that wound is closed, once it's healed and closed, then stuff can't get in it anymore. It can't be festered anymore. Well, the same thing is true with an emotional wound. So if you have emotional wounds that you have not let the Lord fully heal, then that's how the enemy can take advantage. He can just go in there and poke around as much as he wants, and he will use whatever he can to do that. He will use people, in your life. He'll use strangers. He'll use your own family and friends, whoever he can, get to manipulate just the way he wants, to say just the right thing at just the right moment that he knows will hit that trigger, so that he can just continue to manipulate those wounds and have you have these overly emotional reactions. So again, just to kind of give you understanding about what's actually happening. So again, a trauma brain basically constantly has its antenna up. It's constantly scanning for anything that might hurt you. It's looking for danger. It's basically initiating that fight or flight response before the thinking brain has time to analyze it. So it's literally before you have time to stop and think about it. Your feeling brain reacts before your thinking brain. And so it just goes ahead and triggers this release of stress hormones. And again, it can also store these stressors and traumas, which will later return as physical symptoms or flashbacks. Again, scientifically saying return as physical symptoms or flashbacks. Spiritually, that's an attack of the enemy, right? So if something is stored, a trauma is stored, and it hasn't been fully dealt with, you haven't addressed it with the Lord, you haven't sat with him around it, let it finish, quote, processing, so that it doesn't have that open wound for the enemy to come in and out of anymore, then you can still have physical symptoms from it, or you can have flashbacks from it. The amygdala can also initiate safety and survival responses to situations of uncertainty, not necessarily fear, which leads to anxiety. So again, meaning that it might not even be an actual stressor where there's fear involved. It could just be a situation of uncertainty where you don't know if something bad might happen. And that is enough to lead to anxiety, because basically it's trying to predict anything that might happen. It's trying to predict where there might be an event that's adversive. And so basically you start to end up with a situation where a neutral stimuli eventually becomes associated with a fear response just because there's this possibility. So say you went to the movie theater one time and you had a panic attack while you were in the movie theater, and then you went home. So that was traumatic for you. So then the next time somebody invites you to a movie, you start to have this uncertainty that there might be an aversive thing that happens at the movie theater because of what happened to you before. So now a neutral stimulus, which is just going to the movies, now elicits a fear response out of you because of something that happened before. So this is literally where anxiety comes into play. So this can also impair your ability to form positive memories because it is so focused on survival that it literally only focuses on the bad, because it's thinking it's helping you in that way. It's thinking it's helping you to survive, keeping you safe by being vigilant. But in doing that and focusing only on the bad, and also trying to protect you, quote unquote, by expecting the worst, it impairs your ability to remember anything positive because you're only focusing on the bad. So now that we kind of have a little bit of understanding there, now I want to look at the trauma responses. So again, to go back to that specific definition about trauma being an injury or a wound caused to living tissue by an outside agent, not inherent, permanent, or in your real nature. So again, remembering that your response is not who you really are. This is a response that your body basically built to try to protect you, to try to survive it. So those three responses again are fight, flight, and freeze. And fight can come out looking like anger, aggression, criticism, pride, self-righteousness. Flight will come out looking as avoidance, isolation, irresponsibility, false humility, which basically, if you don't know what false humility is, that's basically you just saying like, oh, I could never do what you're saying. Like I could never be the leader because I'm not made for that, and I'm not, made to be a leader. And you're putting yourself down, but it's like in this false, humble way, like, oh no, I could never do that. And it's actually pride is what it is, because when it comes down to it, you're saying you know better than like what God's saying. Basically, if God's saying, hey, I created you to be this mighty warrior, I created you to be a leader, and you're going, oh no, not me, Lord, that's false humility. And then the freeze response tends to come out as paralysis, procrastination, and laziness. So I'm going to focus on the freeze response in this particular teaching just because, again, freeze is something that a lot of people experience if that was especially imprinted as a baby or as an infant. And freeze is kind of what's operating a lot of times behind stress in general, but especially in our current society, all of these things that are like labeled as, autoimmune conditions. So adrenal fatigue or chronic fatigue, things like that. What's kind of going on behind that is this freeze response, because it's basically like having the gas and the brakes both pushed down at the same time. So it can look low energy on the outside. You can look at someone and think, well, they just look normal. But inside, they're actually very high energy, because inside, again, their brain is going 100 miles an hour and it's trying to protect them. And that's why the person can end up feeling so fatigued, even when they aren't doing anything. They're just going through their regular day, and yet they feel so fatigued. They feel like they ran a marathon. Well, it's because inside their body is running all these different processes and all these operations to try to keep itself safe, even when like all the person actually did was got up, got in traffic, went to work, got in traffic, came home. But the body overreacted to all of these stressors, and that's why it's so high energy inside. The person can end up feeling exhausted, which can then lead to these autoimmune conditions. So this is also especially bad if the body has stored up experiences from the past where you couldn't fight, couldn't flee, and you just had to endure. And that's, again, what we were talking about, like if you had a traumatic birth, if you had a traumatic childhood, or even as an adult, if you had situations where you couldn't fight, you couldn't flee, you just had to hold on and endure, then this will also just exacerbate this problem. So when freeze is your normal response, your body's default response, then anytime you perceive a threat, and again, this could be a real threat or just a perceived one that's not even real, your system's response will be to slow down, to get foggy. So that's again why you could start to have feelings of like difficulty concentrating or difficulty remembering things, because you have this brain fog going on. You get tired and you lose motivation. So these are the ways that it feels physically. But what's happening is because your subconscious is trying to survive the stressor by basically saying, stay down, be still, be quiet, don't let anyone see you. So it's bringing your body down into this state, and you're wondering, why am I so tired? Why can't I focus? Why do I have brain fog? Well, your system is registering stressors around you and saying, you got to come down, be still, stay quiet, don't move to quote unquote survive. So again, you can see where this could be a problem when God is trying to speak new things over you, because then if any of these new things he's bringing are remotely stressful, which they always are, because following Jesus is like riding the best roller coaster ever. So it's good, but it can feel stressful to your body. Then you can see where this would be difficult, because your body is going to again fight against you. So that inertia and that immobility, again, can be perceived as laziness, but it's actually a programmed response that's inside of you from the past. And it's really a technique to survive. So this is, again, what I was referring to earlier, where it's like you can subconsciously assess the dangers of a situation and choose whichever one seems easier or whichever one seems safe, even if it's an enjoyable experience, even if it's something that you would like to do. Your body will subconsciously tell you it's safer to do, the safer option, and then have you turn down the other thing. And this is really where a lot of anxiety comes in. This is where a lot of social anxiety comes in, which is also something that I dealt with in my past, where it would just, even though I wanted to go out and do things, it just felt quote unquote safer to me to stay home. So then I would stay home, and then that would just lead to more feelings of sadness and depression, because I wanted to go out, but I felt like I couldn't. So you can see where it can just kind of spiral. So the freeze response is also referred to a lot as the lost child response, because again, it's something that basically gets developed when a child feels like they can't fight back or they can't flee. So instead they find their safety or their safe space inside of their own mind. So that can again look like zoning out, daydreaming, really kind of disassociating from what's happening. And that can start as a child, but that can continue through adulthood. And then again, these people can get labeled as being flighty or being, somebody who doesn't pay attention and just wanders off in their own thoughts. Well, that can be because they developed a response for protection early on, and then that just becomes a normal response. But what's actually underneath that is fear and, believing that they are somehow in danger. So again, some ways that this can manifest in the natural and what this can look like is having intrusive thoughts and feelings. So again, kind of that what if always bothering you. Well, what if this happens? What if that happens? Just having these survival-based thoughts that are extremely annoying. It can also manifest as avoidance, as an inability to trust people, meaning you feel the constant need to check in with people. Are you okay? I haven't heard from you. You didn't answer my last text. Did I make you mad? All that kind of stuff. As well as testing your relationships. That hypervigilance, again, always trying to expect the unexpected. Feelings of isolation and withdrawal, difficulty making decisions or remembering things, or also procrastination. So I did want to take just a minute to look specifically at procrastination, because again, this whole thing is about God wanting to unravel lies that you have believed about yourself and about others. And again, so much of this is known and acknowledged by, people in the secular world, in the natural world, in the physical, in the science. But what's important is to realize how these two things tie together, how we understand what's going on scientifically in our bodies, and then relate that to the spiritual, and realize that the way we get better is by addressing these things with Jesus, letting him transform our mind, heal these wounds, so that this stuff doesn't happen anymore, and we are operating, the way we were supposed to operate. So procrastination is basically a self-defeating behavior. It's a self-sabotaging behavior, because really it's undermining our own best efforts. So that's the most important thing I feel like to realize about procrastination is procrastinators are not oblivious. They are not unaware. They are aware of the harm that is being caused by them temporarily giving in to these feelings of procrastination. They know, hey, I really should be doing such and such. They know, like, this is going to end up bad for me. But they cannot overcome the emotional urge to divert themselves from whatever it is. And again, that's because of survival and self-preservation that's going on inside. So basically, a procrastinator wants to feel good now, in the present moment. So they will comfort themselves with this false belief that they'll be better equipped to handle it later. So if they have to write a speech or a presentation for work, and they're like dreading this presentation for work because they can't stand being up in front of people speaking, and they feel like they're going to have a panic attack and they don't want to do it, then of course they're going to procrastinate getting the presentation ready, but they know that all they're actually doing is defeating themselves and sabotaging themselves, because the less time they give themselves to work on it, the less prepared they're going to be. And then they're going to be even more anxious when they have to get up and do it. But the problem is that they can't overcome this emotional urge to stay safe and feel good in the moment now, which is, don't work on the presentation. Don't even think about the presentation. Go watch Netflix instead. And that's why you end up playing out this behavior. So again, there can be a myriad of causes for trauma responses, but most of them are going to come from things that occurred in your childhood. Feelings of shame, guilt, self-loathing, low self-esteem, insecurity, and all of these things will basically cause you to steer clear of any kind of relationship, any kind of situation that may seem threatening or uncontrollable. Now, the important part to remember spiritually with all of this is we experience what we believe. That's why Jesus tells us hundreds of times in the Bible, I don't know an exact number, but he's constantly saying, just believe, just believe, just believe. It's all about what we believe. He knows this. He's trying to make sure we know this. So false beliefs are basically created as a result of living with negative self-fulfilling prophecies. So what I mean by that is, if you have a self-fulfilling prophecy that is negative, like we talked about earlier, where you believe love is dangerous, love has to hurt, because of how you grew up, and that's negative, but yet you believe it, so it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So then you end up acting that out, you seek that out because, you believe you don't deserve anything better than that. So then even if a good, caring, loving relationship tries to come to you, you reject it and you sabotage it because it doesn't register as normal to you. You don't think you deserve that. Then what comes of that is you end up with this false belief, because then you're like, well, see, I was right. It just got confirmed for me. And it just keeps cycling and cycling. So this is why God wants to renew our mind and change what we believe so that we will then experience different results. So this is where we come into the piece of renewing your mind. This is why the Bible tells us, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Now, to look at what renew actually means. Renew means to make like new, to restore to freshness, vigor, or perfection, to make new spiritually, to regenerate, to rebuild, to revive, or to begin again. And to restore means to return to a former condition, to repair or renovate, so as to return it to its original condition. Now, I put in parentheses here, restore factory settings, because that was something that the Holy Spirit spoke to me, and I thought it was so awesome that he basically just said to me one day, he just said that phrase, restore factory settings. And he sort of walked me through that, as far as that was what he wanted to do with my mind. That was what he wanted to do with my thoughts and my beliefs. He wanted to, just like when your phone is not operating correctly and you have to hit that button and restore it back to its factory settings, restore it back to the way the manufacturer made it, so that it will work more effectively, so that it will work correctly. That was what he was saying to me, was he said, I'm trying to restore the factory settings in your mind. I'm trying to undo all of these incorrect settings that got set up by all these different people and all these different things that happened and all these false beliefs and incorrect perceptions that you had. and get it back to the factory settings he created me with when he formed me in my mother's womb. And that's what he wants to do with each one of us. So he wants us to see where we've had these false beliefs and these incorrect thoughts so that we can give them to him and let him renew our minds. So the word repent means change your mind. So he wants us to change our minds and begin to think differently, that we no longer have to protect ourselves, but let him protect us. Because again, I could go into a whole separate teaching here, and I will do a separate teaching on the Garden of Eden, but think about just the real simple, basic thing that happened in the garden was that basically in that moment, Eve got deceived and she started thinking about God differently. She started thinking about herself differently. Before she agreed with the enemy, they were naked, Adam and Eve were naked, and they felt no shame about it. So they were completely dependent on the Lord. They were completely vulnerable before him. They weren't aware of their self. They weren't thinking about their self. They weren't analyzing themselves. They were just being. They were just existing. They were just loved by the Lord. They loved him. That was it. Then the enemy came along, deceived them, and immediately what happened is they began to think differently. The first thing they did was they looked at themselves, felt ashamed, and covered themselves up and ran and hid from God. So they changed their minds. They started thinking, I have to cover myself up. I have to protect myself. I have to hide from God. I have to be ashamed of myself. And this is where he wants us to renew our mind back to the correct thinking, to the truth. Begin to go back to knowing that he's here to protect us, that he's the good shepherd, that we are the sheep, that it's not up to us, that we are the sheep, and that's okay because we have a good shepherd, and we need to be okay with letting him be our protection. And that's really the hardest part, because our flesh, again, is what fights against us. Our flesh is what tells us that we have to do it, that we have to get everything right, that we have to protect ourselves, that we're on our own. And that's all a lie, that none of that is true. So he wants us to let him renew our minds, let him change our thinking, and help us begin to think differently and go back to the way things were, where we no longer feel the need to protect ourselves. And that in and of itself will help us to let go of all these false lies, because we know God is the one who will protect us. In Matthew 18:3, when he says, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." That word there for children translates to infant. So again, it's about going back to who you were when he formed you in the mother's womb. So literally who you were as an infant, when he formed you together and knitted you together in your mother's womb, before any of those lies started happening, even the birth trauma started happening, who you were back then, that's what he wants to take you back to. That's why you have to approach him as a little child. That's why you have to be willing to be in complete dependence on him. The Message translation of Isaiah 30:15 says that you'll find your strength when you come into complete dependence on me. And that's what an infant does. They are in complete dependence on their parent. They know they can't protect themselves. They know they can't be on the lookout for everything. And they rest in that. They relax in that because they trust their parent to do that. And that's the relationship that he wants to have with us. So these are all just verses that you can sort of meditate on about him forming you in the womb. But again, what he wants you to focus on here is that he is the one that did that. He formed you in the womb. So he wants to take you back to who you were at that moment when he created you, before anything and anyone had a chance to affect you negatively, cause trauma, cause false beliefs, cause false imprints, but who he created you to be. That's who he wants to take you back to in your mind and renew your mind back to. Which again is why we have to be born again. That's what that's referring to, like being born again. When we are born of the Spirit, we are no longer in bondage but are free. It's why Jesus tells us we need to be born again of the Spirit to see the kingdom of God. So we've obviously already been born physically, but we need to be born of the Spirit so that we are no longer in bondage and are free. And this is what he means. Like, let him take you all the way back to who you were when he created you, and let him make you truly born again, so that you release all of those false things, and you are now living a new life completely in him. I hope that makes sense. It's a very, not very, it's a completely spiritual concept, not natural at all. So you have to kind of switch out of your thinking brain and only into the spiritual, and realize what he's actually saying here. So when we make Jesus our Lord and Savior, he wants to give us a new heart and renew our minds. This is why, again, this heart healing that I did a video about, and renewing our minds, why this is so important, because he doesn't want us to remain trapped in the bondage of our old thoughts. But we have to be willing to surrender them to him and ask him to give us his thoughts instead. We have to be willing to ask him to renew our minds to the mind of Christ. And it's funny that, like, I'm saying be willing, because I know on the surface you would go, well, of course I would be willing. Why would I want to hold on to all these old lies? But what you'll realize when you get into this with him, and you actually start doing this with him in the secret place, and you go in the closet and you really start to go here with him, what you realize is that you're going to end up running into opposition in your own flesh. Because even though it's not pleasant, even though it's not desirable, it's comfortable, it's familiar. So when you have to let go of these things and be willing to surrender them to him, you're surrendering to the unknown. You're surrendering to not being in control. You're surrendering to not feeling like you're protecting yourself. And that can be scary when you're in your flesh. That's why you can only do this in his spirit. So I hope that makes sense, because when you do go in there and you feel that resistance, don't give up. Don't get frustrated with yourself. Don't wonder what's going on. That's your flesh trying to work against you. That's why you have to be in control of your flesh and say, no, I'm speaking over you, and I'm surrendering to Jesus, regardless of what my feelings tell me, regardless of what my thoughts are telling me. Because if those feelings and those thoughts are running on an old operating system, an incorrect operating system, then they are going to try to fight against you. But the good news is that you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to do it at all. You just have to be willing to surrender to Jesus, and he will do the hard work. He will renew your mind, but he just needs you to be willing. So again, it's about letting him walk you through those wounds, those areas where you need healing. Let him reveal those lies that you believed and those agreements that you've made. Then choose to surrender them to Jesus. Break those agreements that you made. Change your mind and choose his truth instead. And ask him to replace those false lies, those false beliefs with his thoughts, and claim it and receive it by faith in the name of Jesus. And remember, have grace for yourself, have patience and kindness for yourself, because just like heart healing, this is a process. This is not something that just happens one and done. You don't go in the closet one time and pray and it's done. It's a process, but Jesus is the one who does the hard work. So again, all he needs you to do is surrender and be willing to let him do it. Because remember, you do not have to live in the bondage of trauma. You do not. Jesus is the great rescuer, and he wants to rescue you. So just be willing, just be trusting, surrender to him, know that he loves you, know that he will take care of you, know that he will do the hard work, and just trust that you are safe with him, and let him renew your mind and let him heal your heart so you can be who he created you to be from the very beginning.